Hi, this is Greg Kesich. I'm the editorial page editor at the Portland Press Herald. And this week on the podcast, we're taking a break from the usual political roundtable, and we're not going to talk about Donald Trump or Paul LePage or whether or not Susan Collins is going to run for governor or any of that exciting stuff. I have two reporters in who have been covering this mind-blowing story that played out at the courthouse yesterday with Anthony Sanborn after 26 years. How many years in prison?
27 years.
27 years in prison, has been
Sanborn.
Released on bail because a judge determined that he was likely to succeed in his attempt to get a new trial. And this is a decision that's pretty much unprecedented in Maine, I believe.
That's right.
And it really kind of challenges everybody's ideas about how the criminal justice system works, and or should challenge everybody's ideas, and it especially us in the media, but also the public and police, et cetera. But anyway, great story. I'm here with Matt Byrne, who is our cops reporter, and Ed Murphy, who is our courts reporter. And they have been covering this case for about 6 weeks. And thanks for making the time. I know this is a very busy day for both of you. I'd like to just go back to the beginning and talk about the original incident that sent Anthony Sanborn to prison.
Sure.
You want to start, Matt?
Sure. Yeah. It was May of 1989, and it was the 24th. And it was a kind of chilly, drizzly morning, and at the time, Maine State Pier was half occupied by a Bath Iron Works dry dock. And at the far end of the pier, in the shipping and receiving department, Bath Iron Works employee actually went outside to use the bathroom, so to speak, and discovered behind a dumpster a huge pool of blood, and immediately contacted a security guard, and police showed up, and it was clear very quickly that something was amiss. They determined it was human blood. And the investigation began that morning. And before the end of the day, divers were in the water, searching the area under Maine State Pier. And on their first pass underwater, they discovered the brutally murdered body of Jessica Lynn Briggs. She was in about 30 feet of water, face up. And when they brought her to the surface, they found that she had been stabbed and slashed, and her throat had been cut. And it was a shocking murder at the time. She was 16. She was a young woman with a bit of a troubled past. She had been in the Maine Youth Center a number of times and was actually a runaway at the time of her murder and known to police. And she used aliases to avoid arrest, and wasn't staying with her parents. And she was a kind of member of this whole group of young people who lived on the streets of Portland at the time, kind of moving from apartment to apartment, living their lives free of any real scrutiny from their parents or any authorities.
That's an interesting point. I don't know. How old were you in 1989?
I was barely about 2.
Okay, right. So Ed and I were here then.
Yes.
And Ed was working for the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember about the city back then?
Well, it's much like Matt just described. There was a large group of very young runaways. At the time, the youth center had practically no security. Kids would get taken up to the youth center for some sort of petty crime, and they walk out within hours. And of course, they headed downtown. There was kind of a support system there for somebody who's 15, 16 years old. Some of them could get jobs, but they were a constant thorn in the side of Portland police. I talked to Mike Chitwood, who was police chief at the time recently, and he was talking about how he had a long-running beef with the youth center. The fact that they brought kids there, did not really keep them locked up, and then they would walk out, they'd walk downtown, and they became his problem. And so, there was a tension there between the police and this group of young teens who would, commit petty crimes, use drugs, that type of thing. And so the police were bothered by them, but found there was little they can do, because if they arrested a kid for something, there was a good chance that, within a day or two, they'd be right back down.
They just send them back to the youth center, and they'd walk out. Yeah,
exactly.
And They were able to walk out because there was no fence. There was no perimeter. There was what they referred to as the secure treatment unit, which was the smaller kind of inner area that was secure, where the most dangerous and the most potentially criminally liable young people were held. Eventually, Anthony Sanborn was held in that unit, but it was a system of cabins. And for most of the lower security young people, they could come and go if that's what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
And there were also programs to keep these kids employed, to have kind of at the end of their sentence a job, a work study, if you will. You know, they'd come back to the youth center, or were supposed to, at the end of each day. And that's actually how Jessica Briggs fled the facility. She was working at the IHOP in South Portland, and had really progressed. She had kind of put down some of the bad habits that got her there. You know, she was in there for a burglary charge, which is relatively serious for a 15, 16-year-old girl, but she started to get her life back together. She had this job. She wanted to move on. Her family lived in Augusta, but she had no desire to be in Augusta. She wanted to be in Portland. And at the time, she was a ward of the state, and there weren't any places for these kids. So they'd reached the end of...
Let me ask you, sorry to interrupt. So you mentioned Anthony Sanborn. Who was he back then? What was he doing?
Anthony Sanborn is one of these other kids who grew up in Portland. He grew up at 32 Oxford Street. It's still where his mother lives today. And it was not a great neighborhood then, and it still is not a great neighborhood now. And he kind of ran with the same tough crowd. He was kind of strong, stoic, quiet type who, you know, he was a good fist fighter, and he had a reputation that kind of preceded him. He had been in and out of the main youth center as well. And at the time, you know, this whole group of teenagers they all knew each other. They all hung out around Kennedy Park, around Lincoln Park, Peppermint Park. These were their kind of meetup spots, and they'd sneak out at night and drink coffee brandy together and roam the old port on foot or on bikes. And he and Briggs had a very brief dating relationship. It lasted about 3 weeks from all evidence in the case file. And at the time, it's almost, looking back, it's almost humorous the way that these young people move from girlfriend and boyfriend to girlfriend and boyfriend so rapidly.
Yeah.
They would have these relationships that were on and then off.
Right.
2-3 weeks we were girlfriend and boyfriend, and then we broke up, and then they were dating someone new. They all kind of dated each other, and there were feuds to that end, jealousy and backstabbing and all the kind of regular teenage drama. But it was overlaid in this kind of higher stakes environment where there weren't parents around, and there were drugs, and
they weren't going to school.
They weren't going to school.
It was kind of a self-regulating society.
Absolutely. They looked out for each other too, because a lot of these kids didn't have healthy home lives.
All right. So that's great context. Now the police found the body. Then what?
So at the time, Bath Iron Works was the nearest kind of large institution to the murder scene. You also had the entire Commercial Street scene. The murder occurred, they think, late on the 23rd of May or early on the 24th. And the investigation pretty quickly centered on this group of teenagers that Briggs ran with. The police attempted to interview some Bath Iron Works employees as well, some sailors whose ships were in dry dock there and were stationed there. But the investigation focused pretty quickly on these teenagers. And at the time in our paper, these teenagers were being interviewed by reporters at the time, talking about how the police were taking hair samples and asking people to submit to lie detector tests. And the investigation seemed to seek to recreate this timeline of where was Briggs that night? Who was she with? Who was important in her life? Who would have a reason to hurt her? and that focused mostly on this group of teenagers. So pretty quickly, apparently, the police hone in on Anthony Sanborn Jr.
Do you know why?
I think that's the big question right now. In light of what's happened this week, his attorneys are trying to unwind exactly how the investigation landed on him as the primary suspect. But it seemed at the time that he had a motive. In their trial, the state alleged that Sanborn had just come back to the state after traveling. He was in Virginia Beach with a friend. So if that's any indication of the amount of freedom that these kids had, he picked up and went to Virginia Beach and said, "See you later, Mom and Dad, I'll be back." And when he came back, his relationship with Jessica kind of picked up again. And they were staying together. They were seen together earlier that week, according to the state. And on the night of her murder, the prosecutors alleged that he was looking for her and he was angry at her because she had kind of left him in a huff that morning. They had stayed together and she got up and left. And as the state tells it, Jessica was working at DeMillo's, a staple of Portland.
Right.
Relatively
one of the few things that has not changed.
Right. Totally unchanged here, an institution.
And it's also important to point out, too, that the police knew Sanborn. They had a beef with Sanborn because there had been a alcoholic guy who was beaten to death about 2 months before.
Yeah, not Jessica a long time
Briggs.
At all.
And the guy that that was eventually convicted for the murder knew Tony Sanborn, and he and Tony Sanborn ran into each other half an hour or so after the death. And so Tony Sanborn was supposed to testify before the grand jury on this, and instead he skipped town. So
that's when he took off to Virginia
that's when
Beach.
He took off. Yep.
He was supposed to testify before a grand jury and said, "I don't rat," or whatever his thought process was at that time, and said no thanks, and off he went out of state.
Right.
So they knew him he was a known quantity in some ways, and when they picked him up in Virginia Beach, it was on an entrustment violation, as they say, because he had been entrusted to leave the youth center prior, and they picked him back up and brought him back to Portland. So Sanborn was known to them, and his relationship with Jessica made him, I think at the time, a suspect, among others, but a suspect.
How long after the murder was he charged?
That's an interesting question. It was a good amount of time. It was 1990, I believe, when he was finally charged. The murder again happened in May of '89, and here's another peculiar aspect of this young man's life at the time. When he was not living with his parents, he had befriended an older guy, an adult, a Marine veteran named Jerry Rossi, and they ran together. They were roommates. They traveled together, and Rossi and Sanborn had taken off together to Florida, and they were traveling together in Rossi's car, and Rossi gets arrested for some traffic violation in Volusia County, Florida. And the police officer says something like, "Well, hey kid, you can drive, here's the keys." And Sanborn takes off. And Rossi told him, "Hey, leave my car in this place at this time, and when I get out, I'll pick it up." And Sanborn did not do that, and was later found with the car and arrested, and actually jailed in Volusia County with Jerry Rossi in the same facility. And under an assumed name. And at this point, the Portland detectives had already honed in on Sanborn and were in pursuit of him. And it's actually from Florida that he's extradited back to Maine.
So what was the evidence that led them to charge him with this crime?
So the state's case hung on three main points. You had and all of these points are circumstantial. At the murder scene, there was physical...
Which we should say is not uncommon in a murder case.
Yes.
Because, you're missing the primary witness.
Absolutely.
Is the victim.
Absolutely.
Usually, you know.
And in this case, there was no murder weapon ever found. And there was no DNA evidence that directly linked Sanborn to the crime or the crime scene, or any other physical evidence that linked him to the end of that pier that night. So it was constructed, their case was constructed on witness testimony. And that came in three major segments. You had the circumstantial building of a timeline by the police of who in this young group of teenagers were where. Where were these people that week of her murder? Who saw whom where? And what did they say? When did you last see Tony Sanborn? That kind of thing. What was he doing and where was he going? What kind of mood was he in? Was he angry? Was he happy? That kind of stuff. So at trial, there's a series of witnesses who testify about Sanborn, where he was and what he was doing. Then you have Jerry Rossi. And Jerry Rossi was arguably the second most important witness at trial. Rossi testified that after the murder, when he's living with Sanborn, at three different points, Sanborn offers him increasingly detailed and graphic descriptions of the murder and confesses 3 times. And that's huge for the state. Mm-hmm. Rossi gives them arguably about half of the evidence that would convince the jury. He said that he never came forward because he was afraid of Sanborn, because Sanborn knew of all the illegal things that Rossi had been doing, and Rossi was on probation. He was a man in some jeopardy as well at the time, mm-hmm. from his prior history. So,
and what was the other half?
The other half brings us back to this week, and that's the only eyewitness at the time of this murder. A young woman named Hope Cady. Hope also was one of the young kind of street kids around Portland, and she was younger than
13 at the time.
than Sanborn and Briggs, who were both 16. So she was 13 in 1989. And according to the police, she comes forward much later in 1992, I believe.
The police said they had several encounters over that 3-year period between the murder and when she finally came forward, at which they tried to get her to tell what she knew or what they believed she knew. And she kept resisting. She was fearful of what might happen to her. And so it was a long, drawn-out process of, according to the police, chance encounters with her, at which they continually tried to prod her to come forward.
Right. And Hope was scared of the police, and she too was a ward of the state. She had a caseworker, and she too had been in and out of trouble mm-hmm. for a long time. And she was living on the streets and, drinking and using drugs. And remember, she's only 13.
Anthony's been charged.
That's right.
And Hope, they're interviewing Hope post indictment.
That's correct. That's my understanding, and that's not uncommon.
No, it isn't. But so when and the trial wasn't until 92?
93.
93.
Late in 93. So
October, yeah.
October of 93. So Sanborn sits in Cumberland County Jail for 3.5 years.
Now 20.
Now he's 20, and the investigation's 19 or 20. The investigation's going on all this time. They're re-interviewing or having these chance encounters with Hope Cady. And eventually, Hope describes this terrible, terrible thing that she saw, this scene on the end of the pier. And she told the police that she had gotten into an argument that night with her boyfriend, and she went out to take a walk to clear her head. And she had a special place up on the Eastern Prom, and she liked to go there to watch the sun go down. And it was dark out, and she started to wander back towards Commercial Street and the Old Port. And she says that she's walking down Commercial Street from the Eastern Prom, and she sees Jessica Briggs. She sees her and walks past her, and Jessica goes one way, Hope goes the other, and they kind of, Hope circles back in some way and ends up sneaking her way onto one of the piers on the waterfront. And exactly where and which pier becomes very important. But she testifies that she is out on this pier and she's in a darkened, kind of secluded location. No one can see her. And she hears two voices that she says are familiar. She hears the voices of Jessica Briggs and she hears the voice of Anthony Sanborn, and they're coming down this pier. And according to Hope Cady, there's a third person present on that pier that night, and potentially two more. And the third person she identified was another friend, another acquaintance of the Sanborn Briggs group, Michelle Lincoln.
And she sees all this from a considerable distance at night, and the pier was not brightly lit. It wasn't like there were big floodlights all over the place. There were street lights on the pier, and
there's a building there now at the end of the pier, but that wasn't there then. It was just a big flat concrete.
There were buildings. It was a BIW dry dock, and there was a big shipping and receiving department. So there was on the pier itself. On the pier itself. Okay. So there was a large building, and there was a dumpster there, and the pier was under construction. It was this kind of transformational time for the waterfront, and the pier as we know it today was being built actively at that time, and BIW was transitioning out in the near future at that time. So it was kind of a, for lack of a better term, it was a kind of porous environment. There were a lot of ways to kind of sneak around, and there was a construction site that Hope apparently. So what did
the jury hear? They heard from Rossi, and they heard from Hope that she saw this group of people on the pier.
That's right.
From far away.
And they came.
And saw what?
And saw this group of people, Anthony Sanborn, Jessica Briggs, Michelle Lincoln, and two shadowy figures who were never identified, play this sinister game of Ring Around the Rosie, where they're backing Jessica into a corner, essentially, and pushing her around one to the next. And according to Hope, Michelle Lincoln, this other friend, lands the first punch and strikes Briggs in the face once. And Sanborn is the second to strike out. And she first believed that Sanborn was punching Briggs, but later claimed that it was stabbing, actually, and that Sanborn had taken a knife from somewhere and was stabbing her repeatedly. And at that point, when Hope realized what she was witnessing, she ducked back from view and stuck to the shadows and left the pier and the waterfront, scared of what she saw. Mm-hmm. And that's really the heart of her testimony, that she saw Anthony Sanborn kill Jessica Briggs.
So they have one witness that says that she saw the crime. They have another witness that says he confessed to the crime. They've got kind of a suspicious pattern of behavior where he's disappearing, wanted for testimony, and disappears. And he had a relationship with her, so he had some previous potential motive.
That's right.
And
That's right.
The jury heard all that, 1993, and said guilty. Right.
They deliberated after a 9-day trial.
And do you know how long they were out?
I believe they were out less than a day. I want to say 10 or 11 hours.
Yeah.
And an important thing to remember is during a jury trial, they're not allowed, the members of the jury are not allowed to take notes.
Yeah.
They're hearing dozens of these detailed, complicated stories about other people's lives, and they're charged with taking in all of this information and processing it and evaluating it. And during deliberation, they can call back and say, could the clerk or the stenographer please read back testimony? And in the reading of the tea leaves of a jury, whose testimony they want to hear read back to them again can be an indicator of what testimony they believe is most important. Uh-huh. And Hope Cady was the only person that the jury sought to have testimony read back for. They were focusing on Hope Cady's eyewitness identification of Anthony Sanborn as the perpetrator. And they came back with a guilty verdict.
Uh-huh. And the sentence was what?
He was sentenced later to 70 years.
70 years.
In Maine State Prison.
Okay. So, Ed, I have no recollection of this case at all. And, it's amazing to me. It just seemed like such a routine. It must have seemed like such a routine crime. Do you remember it at all?
I have vague recollections of it, and when Matt first found out about the motion to get bail for Tony Sanborn, I had very vague recollections, but it was I think the community kind of viewed it as this is an infighting among this group of teens that's always causing problems in Portland. And so I don't think they really focused on it as a major crime or thought about it being a 16-year-old girl who was brutally stabbed on the waterfront. Where if the kid had come in from South Portland or Cape Elizabeth or Cumberland or Falmouth or something, and this had happened, I think there would have been a lot more attention focused on it. But because of who was involved, both as far as the suspect and as far as the victim, I think there was not a lot of attention focused on it.
Yeah, I remember somebody from the DA's office once told me the key to a successful criminal career is picking the right victim. And these kids were perfect victims because nobody cared about them.
Right.
I mean, I'm not saying that nobody cared about these individuals or that they didn't have families that loved them, but in terms of the sort of the community consciousness, there wasn't a lot of concern. There was at that time. I remember there was the Father Lozon. He was an abusive priest case, and his victims were all street kids. They were not kids from his parish.
Right.
They were just these loose kids.
Yeah, I think to the public at large, this was not.
There was a lot of prostitution
right.
up the other end of Congress Street,
right.
the West End.
And I also think
Square.
that to the public at large, they couldn't relate to either Jessica Briggs or to Tony Sanborn or this whole group of kids. This was it was almost like just figure out who did it, and we're sure it was somebody that she knew and somebody in that group of kids. And
absolutely,
yeah. Shame on us, right?
Exactly.
This is a classic thing.
But it wasn't the kind of case of community up in arms over this young girl being brutally murdered.
Right.
It was not that sensational, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So.
I spoke with a really interesting guy who at the time, at this time period, was volunteering at the Maine Youth Center as a kind of group therapy facilitator. And it gave him access to this exact demographic of kids. And he spoke very passionately about kind of his position as a bystander, watching this group kind of filter through the Maine Youth Center and watching the rest of society kind of shrug their shoulders at them. And it was a revolving door in a lot of ways. And it was very frustrating to this guy. And he talked about Sanborn in particular, and his reading of the case and of the prosecution was that who should care? These are throwaway kids anyway.
Yeah.
They had opted out of society at large. They didn't want to go to school. They didn't want to have anything to do with the kind of regular life that most kids don't think twice about.
Right. And they're capable of terrible things.
Right. That's the implication.
It's not a stretch of the imagination.
And to be fair, they got into trouble.
Yeah.
They played by their own rules. When Mike Chitwood, the chief of police at the time, was hired, he created a task force to basically address what he saw as the end result of these kids' criminality, which was this huge increase in auto breaks and auto break-ins and burglaries. And that was kind of part of his campaign against this lax attitude at the youth center. And I think it was hugely alienating to these kids that they had already been pushed out of their life by their family in some ways. And when all of regular society said, well, you're bad folks, they turned to each other.
Right.
And it became a strange kind of supportive atmosphere among the kids.
All right, so this is a really important backdrop to what happened yesterday, but there's more because Anthony Sanborn was convicted. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison with good time. That's something like 58, 60 years.
It's virtually a life sentence.
It's a virtual life sentence, and not that we were thinking about him before, but we certainly forgot about him. And many other spectacular crimes have come and gone since then. But something happened in this case that made it stand out? And what is that? What happened here? Why are we having this reexamination of a long ago crime?
It's a great question, and it starts with Sanborn himself. He files a post-conviction review based on DNA evidence, which is a relatively new portion of Maine law. And starting that process means that he was appointed a new attorney, a post-conviction attorney. And he went through a couple of them, actually. And this was several years ago when he started this process. And it gives prisoners the opportunity to re-examine the evidence in their cases. And to say that a lot of prisoners do this is an understatement. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a huge effort by many people locked up to prove their innocence. But what stuck out in this case is actually Hope Cady. Hope Cady became, I think, the first inkling that something was amiss. And after Sanborn had kind of gone through a couple attorneys, he was appointed a Kennebunk attorney, Amy Fairfield. And in kind of extensive conversations with her, she described to me kind of coming to terms with the evidence in this case and some of the lackluster evidence in this case. And one of the first big breaks for her in defending him was Hope Cady's DHHS case file. Remember, she was a ward of the state, and she was appointed a guardian, a social worker who kept meticulous notes. We're talking, more than 1,000 pages of records, and all highly confidential. These are society's most vulnerable kids.
And was this part of the investigation file? How did she get hold of this file?
So that's a great question, because it's not apparent that the defense attorneys at the time had access to it. There was an attempt by them to petition the court for it to be released to them. But that petition was withdrawn. That motion was withdrawn at the 11th hour before trial. And that was, I think, Fairfield's first big step toward opening up this case in a new way, was receiving some very specific permission to have access to these Health and Human Services records.
Because there is a rule now in the court where you can get, it's called a Clifford ruling, where you can get an order from a judge requiring these files to be turned over to defense attorneys.
You're right. So she filed a Clifford order, and the first thing that leapt out at her and became the central point of the hearing this week was Hope Cady's vision and her ability to see.
The eyewitness.
The eyewitness's ability to see. And it sounds comical, but she had serious vision problems, and yet was put on the witness stand to give an eyeball identification of Anthony Sanborn from a distance, late at night. She's 13 at the time. It's a dimly lit pier. And she had only met Briggs, Sanborn, and Lincoln very briefly and in passing.
It was at a party, I think.
She had met Briggs and Sanborn, and she never even spoke to Sanborn, or I think heard him speak.
So what year is this? When is Fairfield assigned to the case?
All of this is happening in the last 11 months. This has been a really brief.
You mentioned in one of your stories about a freelance journalist who had some impact in this. Can you tell me that part of the story?
That's right. This is another interesting part of this case. Just to back up to the description by Hope Cady of this murder, she alleged that another young woman, Michelle Lincoln, was present for this murder. Michelle Lincoln was never called at trial. She never testified. That's a separate issue. But Lincoln ended up staying in touch with Sanborn. They grew up together. They were friends, separate from all of this. They knew each other. And after Sanborn got locked up, Michelle Lincoln reached back out to him about 10 or 11 years ago. And they struck up a strong relationship. And they even got married. They got married in February of 2012. And she lives in Westbrook, and she's a, professional woman and has a great job and a life. And Anthony Sanborn's case kind of became her cause. And she had copied, 600, 700, 800 pages of court records, and she's not an attorney. And she was trying to, climb this mountain of proving his innocence, and opened up a Facebook page or something one day and saw an internet story about an innocence case, and clicked on the link and looked at the byline and said, apropos of virtually nothing, I'm going to reach out to this guy. I'm going to reach out to this journalist, virtually out of the blue. Mm-hmm. And she does. And his name's John Rudolph. At the time, he was a Huffington Post reporter and had done freelance work for the New York Times and covered the BP oil spill and a lot of environmental issues, and, had a track record of publishing in big name newspapers and organizations. And this is the part of the story that we're still trying to suss out, because John has been working kind of behind the scenes until recently. Uh-huh. And she reached out to him, and he ended up moving to Maine.
Wow. To
follow this case, and spent years on it before Amy Fairfield was appointed. Uh-huh. And he started doing what any good investigator does, which is re-interviewing all the witnesses and reading all their statements and trying to square what someone's recollection is now with what the police said happened and the trial testimony and the circumstances. And, it's the whole process of applying a fresh set of eyes to an old set of facts. Mm-hmm. And his work ended up kind of lining up with the same investigative work done by Fairfield's private investigators. So they were beating down the same path, and sooner or later they ran into each other. I think quite literally, showing up in the same places on the same day to interview the same people. Uh-huh. So far he hasn't published anything. He's been working years on this, and I wouldn't be surprised if it came out in book form at some point in the future. But he's been credited by Sanborn and the attorneys with pushing this case in a different way than the legal system could offer. And that's quite extraordinary. Haven't heard much about how and why he chose this case, or what led him to believe there was something here worth spending years on. But I'm sure we're going to find out more about that soon.
Well, you're going to get calls now. It's every time when you do what you guys do, you get calls from people who say I'm innocent, or you get letters from jail, and it almost never seems to be worth doing that kind of work, because everybody in prison says they're innocent, and it's I think a real vulnerability of our system is that we just. And I don't mean reporters. I mean, everybody assumes that, everybody who gets convicted, did something. If not the thing they got convicted for, that they're guilty of something, and I think the cops think that. I think their lawyers think that. I think, the jurors think it, and it is it creates some real potential for things to go awry. Now, what was the substance of the motion that they brought to court that showed up this week?
It's quite a long motion. It's what was about 60 some pages.
60 some pages, about 104 with exhibits.
Yeah. And what Amy Fairfield alleged was police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct, and an ineffective defense. And there are allegations of this is we talked about the kind of group that they. Both Jessica Briggs and Tony Sanborn, Hope Katie were in. They were kids who were often doing wrong things and would get picked up by the police. And so if you need that person to testify in a case, it's very easy for the police to say, look, either you help us out here and tell us what you saw or what happened, or these charges that you're facing, we're going to go ahead and move on those. And you're going to, until you're 21, you're going to be in the main youth center. And then after that, you're probably going to end up back in jail shortly after release. And so in this case, Amy alleged that there was a good amount of that. She alleged that there was really not much that the police had on Tony Sanborn that would cause them to focus on him as a suspect. And she also alleges that the lawyers who were court appointed to represent Sanborn did not really do a good job. If you go through the transcript, there's a lot of leading questions. There's a lot of stuff that's kind of brought in out of nowhere, and normally you would expect a defense attorney to object or to try to keep that information out. And in their defense, she alleges that a lot of information was withheld from the defense. There's actually a photocopy she has.
That's really key.
Yeah,
yes.
there's a photocopy of a police report of an interview, and on there was a yellow sticky that said "not for disclosure."
Yeah, and that's
per Detective
and that's where
Young.
And that's where talking about the kind of mechanics of a big criminal case like this are important, because and the police job is to collect evidence and to build a case, which they then give to the district attorney
Right.
or the attorney general, and together they prosecute this criminal case in seeking a conviction.
But by law, they are also required to turn over to the defense
Right.
all the evidence they gather,
That's
plus
right.
any potentially exonerating evidence.
And that's right. And that whole
Because
area.
because they were the state, right? They're not just a participant in the trial. They're not just a contender. They're also representing all of us, and including the defendant. And if they have anything that suggests that the defendant didn't do it,
That's correct.
they're supposed to
That's
share
correct.
that, and they're not supposed to bring charges they don't think are
And
true.
whether it's a minor traffic violation, a minor crime, or anything as large as murder, it's called the discovery process, and it happens in civil court as well as criminal court. And it's the exchange of this information that's the basis of the case. And the state, you have to remember, is to a great degree in control. They control the investigation, which finds a lot of the facts that are argued over in court. They also can control the timeline of releasing that discovery information to the other side, to the defense. And in murder cases, they take years to prosecute because the police collect mountains upon mountains of information. Every time a police officer has a conversation with somebody pursuant to a murder investigation, it's usually recorded audio and mostly now video. If they're in a police station, you get a written report. They'll transcribe that interview. There's physical evidence. There's a mountain of information.
And as you said, they were still collecting evidence right up to the trial.
That's correct.
4 years almost.
That's
or 3.5
correct.
years, including the key testimony, which apparently they got just before the trial. The case
It was in May of that year.
That's right,
Of
yeah.
the year that it went to trial.
And-
It went to trial in October. So
Okay,
And-
it's only a few months.
You have to remember also that Sanborn's family is not, a rich family. They're working class, and his dad was a mechanic before he got injured, and his mom worked nights at a nursing home, and they were just getting by. And he was represented by two attorneys in Portland who were court appointed, one during the juvenile process because he was still 16 when he was arrested, and he had to be bound over, is the term, to adult court. And then he had an adult attorney for the criminal process. And, the court appointed attorneys are private attorneys in Maine, but they're not paid very well. And if you had the option of taking a court appointed attorney or hiring your own with unlimited means, obviously,
well, I mean,
there's a difference.
Both of these guys are highly regarded.
They were.
They still are. They're both still
That's
practicing, and they've both. But it's a yes. They get paid very little, and they have
and you have to remember there's a
resources for investigation.
There's a structural imbalance often in resources. You've got the entire state of Maine and its resources coming to bear on a young criminal defendant here, and two attorneys charged with going through the work of the entire Portland detective squad. Basically at the time they had two lead investigators, and they did hundreds of interviews.
Right. And that's why it's so important for the state to turn over evidence that hurts their own case.
And not just turn it over. Turn it over in a timely fashion, because it takes time to vet that information and figure out where the weaknesses are, where the strengths of that information lie, and probing how it affects the rest of the case. All that takes a great amount of time. And I think there could be an argument made that, the kind of metering out of this discovery information really was a hindrance to the defense. They were, there was an avalanche of information, and I think all they could try to do was not be buried by it.
So, but among that avalanche, there were several key pieces of information that were not turned over, and so you're getting all this information that you've got to weed through, and yet, unbeknownst to you,
the good stuff.
Some of the good stuff is withheld.
Okay, so this is the context for the hearing this week. You've got a conviction, you've got a reopened investigation by the defense, and including work by an investigative journalist. There is so what happened? What happened yesterday?
The first witness and the most important witness to be called back to the stand was Hope Katie, the eyeball witness.
Who is now how old?
She's in her 40s, I believe, and she's living in Augusta, and she's someone with a kind of a severe history of difficulties, emotional difficulties, legal difficulties. And she gets on the stand and in no uncertain terms tells the court yesterday that she was nowhere near that pier, and that her testimony was the product of aggressive and threatening interview tactics by the two Portland police detectives at the head of this case, and that they led her and pushed her and intimidated her into becoming their star witness, to lying on the stand. And that's a huge deal. That's you can't underestimate, the gravity of that, of what that says, because not only is this man wrongly convicted now, but it raises huge questions about the investigators and about the police department at the time. In what kind of environment could this conduct, if it's true, and Hope Katie says it was today, yesterday in court, if it's true, what kind of environment allowed this conduct to persist? Does it have implications in other cases? How does this conduct, if it's true, how does it spread, if at all?
See, I want to get to that, but what did the prosecution question her yesterday?
They did, but Matt and I talked about it after. The prosecution's, the Attorney General's office questioning was rather mild. You've got the Assistant Attorney General who handled the hearing yesterday actually was involved in this case. He was the deputy, I guess, in the prosecution, and
this was Donald Maycomer.
Donald Maycomer,
that's correct,
right?
Yeah.
And he handles a lot of appellate stuff, right? Is that
yes?
His...
And so he was handling this hearing, and his questioning of most of the witnesses was, I wouldn't say perfunctory, but it was not particularly aggressive. And he did at one point say that he was sitting in on some of these interviews that had been conducted almost 30 years ago,
that are now being called into question.
Wow. And he doesn't recall or remember them the same way Hope Katie did. So that's going to be.
So that's what I was trying to understand. That. So he said he wanted to recuse himself because he has firsthand information.
He might be a witness as the hearing goes
forward. The recantation is false.
Right. So if, for instance, if this case goes forward with more hearings, it's possible that the Attorney General's office will call the detectives to testify again, and perhaps Pamela Ames, the lead prosecutor at the time, to give their account.
Who's now a defense lawyer.
Who's now a defense attorney in Waterville. These people could be called back to the stand to recount these events. Did you pressure the witness? Did you lead them to believe this stuff? All this questioning. And
so Hope Katie, she didn't just say, my eyesight's really bad, I couldn't have seen it, or she's saying, I didn't see it.
She said she wasn't even there. She was not down on the waterfront that night. And when you got she really is the only one connecting Sanborn to this. They never found any evidence on the pier that he was there. They didn't find any hairs of him or any blood drops from him or anything like that. And so she is the entire case. And when she's saying, I wasn't even on the waterfront that night, the case totally goes away because there's nothing else directly connecting him.
And at that point,
and you also had testimony from her social worker,
her caseworker, and a very lovely woman named Margaret Bragdon, and she's advanced in age now, but had a pretty good recollection of what happened. And after reviewing these voluminous case notes about Hope Cady, she testified that Bragdon was concerned about Hope's vision and took her to eye doctor appointments and had her see neurologists. And this kind of pursuit of better vision began in 1988, even before the murder.
Within a few months after the murder, her eyesight was tested, and it came up 20/200, which is in Maine legally blind.
Right.
So you've got this person. If you discount the fact that she said I wasn't even there, if you put her on the waterfront, she was a considerable distance away at night with vision that would make one legally blind.
But she could have perfect vision, and if you believe what she said yesterday, she couldn't have seen it because she wasn't there.
Right. It's a contradiction that seems it's hard to untangle at this point.
And Bragdon said she never was explicitly told by Cady that she wasn't there, but she came to believe that Cady did not witness the murder. She felt that it was, as she called it, a war story.
That was interesting.
That this 13-year-old, on the streets girl in Portland, that she told that she witnessed this murder to kind of give her a little bit more credibility among other street kids. I've seen a murder. I know what happened.
So that group you were talking about at the beginning, those kind of feral kids, she wants to raise her status within the group. And she starts telling stories about one of the most prominent events. Like, it might not have been big news for us. It was big news for them.
Obviously. And,
and it was something they were probably talking about.
Kids. And then the other thing too.
That might have filtered back to the cops, maybe people.
How the police started, because it's referred, kind of obliquely in the police reports and the case file that the police started to hear that maybe Hope Cady had information, and, police have all types of different anonymous and confidential sources. And I think in that morass, there's a potential for abuse, potentially. It might be if you never have to identify the person who tells you, oh yeah, Hope Cady knows this stuff. There's no check on verifying how the police became interested in interviewing her. So how they got onto that thread, I don't know. But they did, and they pursued her.
It's very weird the way the police describe it, that they had all these chance encounters with her over a couple years after the murder, that they just happened to run into her and kept on pressing her. According to Hope Cady yesterday, these were extremely, you get a teenage girl, and that she was extremely frightened whenever she had to sit down with the police, that they questioned her at length, that they were abusive towards her in the sense of calling her names, and also that she had this caseworker said, an explosive temper, and there were several accusations of assault against her. And so according to Cady, they use that as well to basically say, if you don't help us out here and tell us what you know, then we're going to go ahead and make sure you're back in the youth center until you're 21.
Right. And we described the youth center as kind of a place where people came and went, but during this period, it was also known that they were doing some very heavy-handed discipline, long periods of isolation, measured in weeks.
That's right.
Long periods of physical restraint.
Right. It was not an enlightened place, to try and get these kids back on the right path.
So it's not just, there was a kind of over supervision and under supervision going on all at the same time.
That's right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So the judge hears from Cady. Anything else? What else did she hear?
Cady has a biological sister who also testified, backing up.
It was very brief, but yeah.
Brief, but reinforcing to say that ever since they were children, small children, Katie has always had problems with her eyesight. She'd had glasses. She'd had glasses almost forever, since you can get glasses, and as a small child, and that she hated wearing them. And Katie even said herself, Hope Katie said herself, I still hate wearing them. Uh-huh. And
I noticed in the picture she wasn't wearing them.
She had glasses up on
at one point to read a document. She, she flipped them down onto her nose and took a look at a document. But she said she still hated wearing them. She kept losing them as a child. She never, made it a priority. So her vision, according to the defense attorneys, was entirely uncorrected at the time of this murder, even if she was there. Uh-huh. So,
and other witnesses recanted?
Not on the witness stand yesterday.
In affidavits, there were 4 affidavits filed with the court yesterday. 2 were from the detectives, Danny Young,
and those were filed by the prosecution.
Right, they were filed by the prosecution, in which they deny any kind of wrongdoing or pressuring or calling Katie names or any kind of lack of turning over evidence to the defense. They just denied it all. And then there were 2 other affidavits filed by Amy Fairfield, the lawyer representing Sanborn, in which 2 other witnesses said that they were pressured by the prosecution and the detectives to testify the way they wanted them to testify, and that they lied on the stand. They flat out say that they lied on the stand because of that. They were worried about retribution from the police or having other charges. And one of them is interesting that it includes about a 1.5-page typewritten statement from this guy in which he basically accounts for Tony Sanborn's movements the days before the murder and right after the murder, the day after the murder, and seeing him and seeing scratches on his face. And the statement is signed by him purportedly, and he said, "I didn't know how to read or write at that point."
He was functionally illiterate, and even at trial, the attorneys for the defense and for the state had to read his own purported statements back to him because he was unable to do so himself. He was important because he basically said that not only did I see Tony Sanborn immediately before the murder, but the night of the murder, I saw him. He was angry at Jessica and looking for her, and he showed me a knife. So he was, as I was talking about the 3 kinds of evidence that they had in this case, he was that circumstantial kind of context for the state, and he completely recanted in this statement.
In his affidavit yesterday, he said that the statement was 99% false. He couldn't read it, so there's no way that the police typed up this, after they typed up the statement, that he could review it and say, yeah, this is accurate or not. He said he couldn't write, so his signature on it, who knows where that came from. He said he didn't sign it. So there's that person and another person who knew Hope Katie. Their testimony didn't seem to be critical, but she also said that she met with prosecutors just before the trial and that they told her what she was going to say and threatened her that if she didn't say that, they would start looking into charges against her or other retribution. So they both said that they lied on the stand under pressure from the prosecutor and from the detectives.
So Judge Wheeler takes a recess.
She does. It's a dramatic moment in the morning, and meets with the attorneys, and comes back and offers.
She goes and she reviews those affidavits.
Right. She reviews this new information that's been submitted, and ostensibly she's also evaluating the witness testimony from the morning, the in-person testimony, and she returns to the bench. And it's important to remember that since the moment Anthony Sanborn walked into the courtroom, he was weeping and in tears. There were so many people there. They lined the walls of courtroom 11. Mm-hmm. It was a packed house, and he said he would have been crying if 2 people or 200 had showed up. But it was a roller coaster for him. You could see the emotion on his face change as the testimony kind of unfurled before him, and then the state's last minute attempt to kind of delay the decision and submit these affidavits and say, to the court, to Justice Wheeler, we need more time. You really need to hear from the other side of this case. That's the police officers. You've only heard one side.
Why weren't they prepared to come forward yesterday?
That's a great question. And I think another thing to remember is the timeline of this filing, of how this hearing came to be. We're just barely a week after the bail motion was filed, a week and a half maybe. Mm-hmm. And since that time, there's been a couple of in-chambers conferences. The most recent one was on Monday between the defense, between the state, and Justice Wheeler, who's specially appointed to this case. She's active retired, so she's coming out of retirement to do special cases, and this is one of them. And after that conference, after reading the bail motion, she said, let's not do it 2 weeks from now. Let's not do it next month. We need to do this in 3 or 4 days. Mm-hmm. This needs to happen now. And to me, that was significant because the gears of justice grind notoriously slowly. And the judge saw that this was a pressing issue enough to say the state needs to come back and we need to argue this now.
So what did she say when she came back from the recess?
Well, she first admonished when Tony Sanborn was brought into the court. You got to imagine there's 100 people there or whatever. They all stood and applauded him. There were 3 relatives of Jessica Briggs there, but other than that, everyone was there. Who was
how awful for them.
It was.
It's unimaginable.
I talked to them,
really.
And the woman was. I talked to to Jessica Briggs' stepmother, Susan Briggs, and she was. It was very interesting. She said she believes he's guilty, and has believed that since the trial. And then she also said, but I also think he deserves his due process like everyone else. And then I talked to her after the evidence was presented. They left very quickly after the judge issued a ruling. And she said she was still convinced of his guilt. Mm-hmm. And that the testimony to her sounded very contradictory, but she was still convinced. And you can only imagine how difficult this must be. These people who lost someone, brutally murdered, and they believe that the police found the person responsible, and he's been in jail, and now, almost 30 years later, they're saying, wait a second, we may have gotten this wrong. And so, and the flip side of that is if Tony Sanborn didn't do it, who did?
Right.
And they're walking out around or whatever, unpunished. So anyway, so Judge Wheeler came back, and she first admonished everyone to not react to what she was about to say. And then she made several statements in which she said that she couldn't believe that the prosecutors went forward with a case based on one not very reliable witness, that she did believe that information had been withheld from the defense, and that she was going to grant bail, at which point people did start to clap. And
boom. It's just, granting bail means that she thinks he's likely
she said
to succeed.
That's the burden, that's right. In a post-conviction review.
And that there was a great likelihood that they would be able to overturn the conviction. And so because of that, he should be released on bail.
Okay, let's talk about. The Byrne issue is it's not like you're innocent until proven guilty. Once you're proven guilty, it's kind of the other way around.
Right. The bar changes and it goes up and it's dramatically higher. The burden's on you to prove that you can't prove that you didn't do it, but that you would be likely to succeed in front of a jury.
Exactly, and it's important to note that she did not say that yesterday. Right. That he that she was overturning the conviction. She said you'll get bail. And she, at one point, said, I would like to.
No, she said, I cannot. This is only a bail hearing, and I cannot apologize to you. But I can say that you have a likelihood of success, and I will grant bail.
Right, and the strong indication was that she wanted to apologize to him. She thought that the case, A, was extremely weak against him, and B, that misconduct had been involved, and she still needs to decide that formally, but yesterday's ruling was just that he would go free and be able to post bail.
And this has never happened in Maine.
It's unprecedented. There's tracking these kind of exoneration processes is difficult because every state has different laws, but there are some universities and groups that do it. And the University of Michigan is one of them. They have one of the more complete databases of exonerations. And Maine has never had a murder exoneration. There's been, I think 2 or 3 other cases involving some serious felonies, but not the most serious, a murder conviction. And we're basically the last state in the union.
So I want to get to the broader implications of this, but just quickly, without every detail. What's left in the process for Anthony Sanborn?
It's a good question, because there could be more hearings. There could be more testimony.
He's got a post-conviction review hearing.
Right. So
she could order a new trial.
The judge could vacate the jury's decision and overturn his conviction. She could order a new hearing in which more testimony could be heard from people involved at the time, such as the police officers or the prosecutor at the time. Yeah. Or there could be no new hearing. It could be a series of filings by both sides. And the judge could decide, as they say, on the paper and say that the evidence submitted in documents is enough. Okay. We're overturning this. Or, something else. There's a lot of discretion here.
But as a practical matter, this would be a very hard case to try again if your star witness says I'm blind and I wasn't
even there. I mean that's
absolutely.
Had I not been blind, I still wouldn't have seen it.
They had a largely circumstantial case to begin with, and the one key piece of evidence is now gone. Plus, you've got almost 30 years has passed. Yeah. So people's recollections are
memories fade.
And this is the thing that's like I just know from my own life. When you tell a story about something that happened, what you remember is the story. And I think we've all seen stories change over time.
That's right. Research.
Sometimes it happened to your friends. Sometimes it happened to you.
And there's great research about this now too. The unreliability of eyewitness testimony and the kind of fallibility of just at a biological level, how memory works. We're not stenographers. We're not cameras.
In the original trial, there's a lot of that going on because, again, this is 4 years after
later,
4 years later.
They're asking people now. Take me back to the night of Tuesday, May 23rd. Where were you at the beginning of that evening and stuff? And so there's a lot of the testimony was very hazy, and the prosecutors are clearly like trying to get people focused on this particular date and time. Yeah. And you are asking about.
And there's this kind of paradoxical problem, assuming for a minute that Sanborn is innocent and wasn't there that night, asking him or anyone around him to remember the particulars of an otherwise uneventful night.
Right.
Is what was there to remember if he wasn't there? It's like if you pick a date out of the book and say to anyone on the street, "Where were you that night?" And, unless it was your birthday or you got into a car wreck, or there's some demarcating event and, you would think that he would remember a murder or he would, the people there would remember these things. And that's what's so frustrating because they say, people who claim innocence say, I have no idea what happened.
Right.
I wasn't there. And it's contradictory to the whole narrative. And what else is there to say, really, right?
Yeah.
If he is, in fact, innocent. So, how this unfolds is...
I mean, I lived in Portland that night. If anybody asked me what I was doing, I would have no idea.
Right.
I could tell you where I lived.
Right.
I could, where I was working, things like that.
Right. Yeah.
So is it true that if you believe what Katie and the other witnesses' statements say, that there was police misconduct? I mean, is there any kind of like innocent middle ground where the authorities could have been mistaken, and you could have come to this result, or is it an either or? Do you have to have police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct, or the witnesses were telling the truth then and they're lying now?
I guess that's always a possibility, but the thing is that they have several statements by people who said that they were pressured by the police into testifying, and then prosecutors testifying a certain way. There clearly was evidence that's available now that was not turned over to the defense.
And that's important because we were talking about the discovery process earlier and the expectation and duty by the prosecution to turn over evidence that would clear somebody in jeopardy, or even impeach a witness who implicates somebody. They have to turn that stuff over. So we've seen this in other places where if the due process is corrupted, if the judicial process itself is corrupted, even the underlying offense and the allegation could be true. But if the police subvert the process, if the prosecution subverts the process, that calls the result into question as well. And setting aside guilt or innocence for a moment, that was the other stunning part of this case, is the discovery violations. We talked a minute for just briefly about this document filed. It's Exhibit A. And it purports to be from the prosecution's files, and there's a sticky note on a police report next to 3 names of witnesses. And their statements had been transcribed in the first person. I so-and-so saw this, X, Y, and Z. And the sticky note says, for these 3 witnesses, as per the request of one of the Portland police detectives, do not turn them over to the defense. And it gives a date that request was made. Convert them instead to a shorter narrative, as they call them, which is written not from the first person of the witness, but from the detective. I, Detective so-and-so, interviewed this person who said X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And they're shorter and they're less detailed, and they don't, and you could see how it could be a process to obfuscate details that were unhelpful to the prosecution. And that itself is just a glaring example that needs clarification. We need to know more about how did that note come to be.
Yeah.
And it doesn't bode well if it's true. Why did the police request that of the prosecutor? And why did the prosecutor agree?
I'm really going to be interested to hear what they have to say. Because how we were talking earlier about these being throwaway kids.
Right.
Clearly, not to the police. The police took this case very seriously.
They
right?
did. Yes, they did.
They pursued it for years. You hear about other parts of the country where murders just are routine and they never get investigated. And this clearly was important to this group of investigators.
We're very lucky in Portland not to have a lot of murders every year, and that's I fully expect the police to investigate every one for as long as it takes. So, in that way they were pursuing their duty, but finding out whether they did it within the 4 corners of the law,
right,
is the central question now.
Yeah. So you guys have a lot of work to do on this. I don't want to take any more of your time. This has been fascinating. What you could have heard when the judge came back with the bail decision, I could hear it work through the newsroom. Like he got bail. It was just boom, 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 boom. Everybody was like way more interested in your story than the story. I was more interested than anything I was working on. So I'm really glad you could sit down.
Yeah.
I just to wind it up though, you got a chance to talk to Anthony Sanborn yesterday.
I did.
Had you talked to him before?
I hadn't. I was lucky enough to be invited back to a kind of family gathering in Portland.
What was that scene like?
It's just unbridled joy. People who had spent years sitting through 2 and 3 and 4 hour car rides, going through prison security and sitting in a sterile room to spend a few precious hours with the man seated there in ill-fitting prison clothes in the most terrible environment you could imagine. And there he was standing in one of his good friend's kitchen. And the woman who owns the house, she just stared at him and said, "Tony, you're in my kitchen." "Tony, you're in my kitchen." And it was like, it really revealed how there's so much that's been lost for this man. And it's not about the big life events for him as much as it is the ability to be close to the people who love him and the people who support him. And he wasn't someone who had a lot of, I think, support and guidance as a young person. And to his credit, he spent his years in prison guiding others and providing that support. And I think, it's remarkable that he's come out of prison the way that he has, which is sensitive and feeling and honest and funny and self-effacing and he's just really an interesting guy to be around, you know? You wouldn't know it that he just spent half his life, the better part of his life in Maine State Prison.
Well, it's a tremendous story, and thank you for sharing it with us. And we're looking forward to the next chapter. And great job,
us too. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Portland Press Herald podcast. Make sure you never miss a podcast episode by subscribing on iTunes or your favorite podcast aggregator. For more of our podcasts, visit pressherald.com/podcasts. Follow the link there to this episode to leave a comment. You can also leave a comment on our Facebook page. I'm Chad Gilley. Once again, thank you for listening to the Portland Press Herald podcast.